I woke up on a floor that felt like it was alive, not in the "oh, my carpet has static" sense, but in a "this entire palace is judging my every breath" sense, which, frankly, was unsettling. Above me, glowing veins of light pulsed through the walls, casting colors that shifted from electric blue to something suspiciously like neon fuchsia. I tried to sit up with what I thought was dignity and promptly toppled over, hitting a low, curving table that hummed faintly in protest. It was then that I realized humans were not meant to walk into alien palaces without tripping at least once. A figure appeared, gliding toward me with the poise of someone who had never stumbled over anything in their life. She had ears that stretched long and elegant above her head, like crescent moons made of polished silver. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked over me, and I could swear she smirked at my awkward bow. "Human," she said in a voice that could command entire fleets, yet somehow carried a hint of amusement, "you are unusually graceless." I scrambled to my feet, muttering something about human charm and how it clearly translated poorly in interstellar courts. She didn't seem convinced, but she didn't mock me outright, which I took as a minor victory. The attendant behind her, a thin, humming creature with limbs that bent in angles that made me question geometry itself, handed me a small device that I assumed was for communication. It beeped once, twice, and then, without warning, projected a three-dimensional map of the palace. I blinked. "Right," I said. "I get it. This is where I die or get invited to tea, maybe both." The princess appeared then, slipping in as if she had been hiding in the shadows like some intergalactic cat burglar. Her ears twitched in perfect rhythm with a faint chuckle, and I had the sudden, very human urge to duck and hide. Instead, I greeted her awkwardly, waving a hand like a man who had practiced waving to royalty approximately 0 times in his life. She laughed. That laugh, light, teasing, melodic, was completely out of place among the hard edges of political formality. I couldn't tell if I was more terrified or charmed. Maybe both. We wandered through the palace, my human feet clumsily navigating floors that occasionally hummed beneath my weight. She explained the palace's quirks as if giving a tour, each fact punctuated with gentle jokes about how humans apparently couldn't handle gravity that occasionally decided to nap. I asked if that was a literal warning, and she merely twitched an eyebrow, long ears flicking like twin metronomes, and said, "Only if you survive the tea ceremony." I nodded solemnly, which may have looked ridiculous, but at least I tried. Dinner was an adventure in itself. The food hovered before me, seemingly aware of my hunger, dancing just out of reach until I lunged like a foolish human. My hand clumsily caught a glowing sphere which squirmed gently in my palm. She noticed, of course, and her smirk grew. "Be careful," she said. "That one is mildly sentient, it has a temper." I stared at the sphere as if it might scold me. It didn't, thankfully, but the way it blinked at me suggested it knew I was an amateur in alien etiquette. I swallowed, muttered something about Earth cuisine being dangerous, and took a cautious bite, oddly delicious if slightly crunchy with sparks. I choked slightly and she laughed again. I laughed too, not out of humor, but out of sheer survival instinct. Later, she led me to a hall where holographic star maps floated like galaxies frozen mid-burst. I tried to look dignified, pretending I understood the constellations, though my brain kept shouting, "You're a human, you do not belong here. Stand still." She leaned in, tracing a route between two shimmering points with a long, elegant finger. Her ears twitched as she tilted her head. "You know," she said lightly, "humans are oddly persistent. You survive most things by accident or charm, mostly charm, I think." I blinked. Charm, in my current state, felt like a cosmic joke. She laughed at my expression, a quiet, teasing sound that made my stomach twist. "I can teach you," she added, ears flicking in amusement, "but first try not to explode the palace with your enthusiasm." At that moment, the queen entered. She was statuesque, her long ears arched like polished silver sentinels. I had no idea how to act, except stand as still as possible and hope I didn't inadvertently invent a new form of interstellar offense. The queen's gaze was sharp but not unkind, and I immediately started calculating all possible ways I could accidentally offend a civilization with gestures as innocent as blinking or sneezing. I cleared my throat, which may have been a mistake because the sound echoed across the glowing walls like a small asteroid impact. The princess whispered something that sounded like, "At least you're dramatic," and I wanted to sink into the floor. We moved into a private chamber afterward, which I thought was for rest but quickly realized was another test of human adaptability. Holographic projections swirled, showing alien flora, star systems, and planets orbiting in impossible trajectories. I stumbled, almost colliding with a delicate projection of a gaseous world, and she caught my arm with one swift motion, ears flicking in amusement. "You're worse than a toddler in zero gravity," she said, and I laughed despite my embarrassment. I realized that her humor wasn't just teasing, it was survival advice. If I could laugh, I could navigate this place without detonating diplomatic incidents. By the end of the evening, I found myself sitting in a quiet alcove, exhausted but exhilarated. She perched beside me, ears brushing against softly glowing panels, her presence both comforting and disarmingly electric. I attempted a joke about how humans only meant to explore other worlds, not to be kissed by them metaphorically, or literally, though I was not entirely sure where this conversation would lead. She grinned, leaning just close enough that I could smell a faint scent of starlight and something floral. "You'll do fine," she said, "if you survive my sense of humor." I nodded solemnly, thinking I had no choice but to survive, charm, and somehow keep a grip on my own ridiculously human dignity. Somewhere in the palace, a small alarm buzzed, a polite reminder that the human was still alive, still unpredictable, and still possibly dangerous. I chuckled, muttering to myself about how humans always had to make things complicated, and she laughed, the sound echoing lightly like chimes in zero gravity. And somewhere, between the blinking lights, the pulsing walls, and the long-eared grace of the alien royalty, I realized that survival might actually be the most entertaining adventure of my life. The morning began with the subtle hum of the palace awakening, walls pulsating faintly like the heartbeat of a living organism, as if the entire structure itself was impatient to see how I would fail today. I had learned quickly that humans had a remarkable knack for surviving things we were never meant to survive, and I intended to continue that streak, preferably without triggering interstellar protocol violations. The princess appeared before I could even consider brewing some form of breakfast, a luxury I had yet to discover existed here, and I almost jumped out of my skin. Her long ears twitched like synchronized antennas, scanning me for signs of readiness or perhaps just for amusement. "Human," she said, her voice smooth but carrying a teasing edge, "today is not for dawdling. Today you will walk through diplomacy, humor, and potential chaos all at once. Think of it as a triathlon but with fewer medals and more explosions if you fail." I nodded solemnly, though I suspected my human expressions were horrifically inadequate. She didn't seem to care. Instead, she extended her hand, eyes twinkling, and gestured toward a hovering platform that smelled faintly of ozone and warm metal. "Step lightly," she warned, "and avoid eating anything that moves independently. You'll thank me later." I swallowed, taking one cautious foot onto the platform, which floated smoothly across a hall filled with hovering globes of light and holographic projections. Each step made me hyper-aware of gravity shifts, floating motes of dust, and the occasional sentient fruit that looked as though it might lecture me for my clumsiness. We entered a room where a conference of advisors had gathered, their ears varying in length and angle, twitching in ways that suggested subtle communication beyond my comprehension. I bowed, the motion unintentionally elaborate, perhaps more human than any etiquette required, and immediately caught a faint snicker from the princess. "Your posture," she said under her breath, "suggests you're either praying or preparing to sneeze a diplomatic incident into existence." I vote for the latter. I tried to stifle a laugh, failing, which only seemed to amuse her more. The queen arrived, long-eared and poised like a living constellation, her gaze sharp yet not unkind. She surveyed me as if calculating odds in a game I didn't understand. I offered a cautious smile, which I feared might have been misread as some strange human threat, but she only raised a delicate eyebrow, an alien gesture that somehow communicated both curiosity and authority. The meeting commenced, and I quickly realized that human concepts of diplomacy, handshakes, nods, polite laughter, were as effective here as attempting to pilot a starship blindfolded. My attempts at humor were sporadic but surprisingly effective. A quip about the floating fruit nearly earned a chuckle from a senior advisor, which I took as a small but meaningful victory. Afterward, the princess led me into the palace gardens, which defied any earthly logic. filled with luminous plants that drifted gently in zero-gravity pods, petals opening and closing like miniature moons. I stumbled, tripping over a root that wasn't supposed to exist according to human botany, and she caught me with a swift arm, ears flicking in mock admonishment. "You have the elegance of a starving comet," she said, and I laughed, appreciating that sarcasm here functioned as both humor and survival instruction. She offered a challenge, floating a holographic projection of an alien maze before me. "Navigate this, and I may consider teaching you the subtleties of interstellar charm," she said. I glanced at the maze, a twisting, luminous tangle of shifting corridors and floating obstacles, and nearly reconsidered my career as an intergalactic diplomat. By the time I reached the center, gasping and exhilarated, the princess was already there, smirking. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," she said. "Mostly because you've survived everything I've thrown at you without spontaneously combusting, though that would have been amusing." I tried to nod solemnly, but my ears twitched involuntarily, which she noticed. "Ah," she said, "communication failure, or is that the human signal for embarrassment? Fascinating." I laughed despite myself, realizing that humor was my only real weapon here, besides clumsiness and accidental charm. As the afternoon progressed, I was introduced to a series of palace rituals, each more bizarre and elaborate than the last. One involved aligning reflective spheres to capture starlight. Another required speaking to a floating crystal that hummed in what I assumed was a language of approval or disapproval. I failed spectacularly at both, prompting the princess to laugh so hard that her ears twitched in time with her mirth. "You are ridiculous," she said between chuckles, but somehow in a way that might actually work in your favor. I realized then that my human instinct to laugh at absurdity was perhaps the only trait that could survive the intricacies of alien court life. That evening, we sat together in a chamber where the floor projected the night sky, each star shimmering as if alive. I tried to make small talk, jokes slipping out awkwardly, about how humans explored planets only to get themselves embarrassed by advanced civilizations, and she laughed, longer this time, softer, not cruel but amused, the sound echoing through the luminescent walls. I caught a glimpse of the queen observing quietly, her expression inscrutable, and I wondered if she found our antics irritating or quietly delightful. Somehow, I doubted irritation. The princess's laughter was contagious even across interstellar ranks. As the night wore on, the princess leaned close, ears brushing gently against the glowing panels, and whispered something about teaching me the subtle art of human charm in alien courts. I swallowed nervously, realizing that survival here depended on my ability to balance humor, audacity, and unpredictability. Somehow, I had become an instrument in a game that was part politics, part amusement, and entirely dangerous if mismanaged. She touched my arm lightly, a fleeting spark of contact, and I felt a surge of adrenaline and absurd delight simultaneously. "Do not faint," she said, though her lips twitched with barely suppressed amusement. "That would be entertaining. But unhelpful." Somewhere in the palace, lights shifted, walls pulsed, and I realized that despite all the oddities, hazards, and potential for interstellar scandal, I was beginning to understand the rhythm of this place. Humor was not only a shield but a bridge, and the princess was both the architect and the most dangerous element of the entire structure. By the time I returned to my chamber, exhausted yet exhilarated, I found myself laughing at the absurdity of it all: floating meals, sentient stars, sarcastic long ears, and the looming challenge of surviving alien royalty without either exploding or becoming a diplomatic footnote. And as I drifted to a restless sleep, I knew that tomorrow would be yet another test, another chance to navigate absurdity, charm, and interstellar scrutiny, all while keeping my dignity intact. Somehow, I suspected that the princess had plans that involved both chaos and amusement, and I was entirely unprepared yet curiously thrilled to follow along. The palace hummed softly around me, alive and watching, and I realized that being human here was not just dangerous. It was unexpectedly, irresistibly entertaining. The day began with a calm that felt suspicious, like the eye of a storm hovering in space, and I had learned that in this palace, calm rarely meant safety. The princess appeared beside me before breakfast, ears flicking in perfect rhythm as if the universe itself had a sense of timing, and I knew immediately that today would be the day nothing subtle would happen. Human, she said, a mischievous glint in her eyes, today we make history or disaster, possibly both. I swallowed, nodding like a brave but thoroughly terrified earthling, and tried to ignore the low hum of the palace walls, which seemed to pulse with anticipation or perhaps amusement at my plight. The court assembled in the grand hall, a place where gravity seemed to flirt with reality, where floating chandeliers refracted light into colors that made me squint. The advisors, all long-eared and exuding a mixture of patience and judgment, shifted in their seats as if sensing that today's events would be unprecedented. I tried to straighten my posture, accidentally tipping a hovering teacup that spun lazily before settling back onto its levitating saucer. The princess snickered beside me. Graceful, she whispered, as always. I muttered something about humans never mastering zero-gravity etiquette, and she laughed, a sound that seemed to ripple through the room and momentarily disarm the tension of hundreds of watchful eyes. Then the queen entered, long ears arched like silver towers, her presence commanding enough to still the floating lights. I felt my pulse spike, my human instincts screaming that any misstep could become interstellar news. But the princess, leaning casually on a nearby pillar, winked at me. Relax, she said. Mostly. I took a deep breath, attempting a bow that probably resembled a complicated fall, and prepared for the ceremonial greetings that would inevitably lead to diplomatic conversations I had no hope of understanding. The ceremony began, advisors whispering in subtle signals, the queen speaking in a tone that balanced authority and precision, and I did my best to appear composed. I cracked a small joke about Earth customs, something about humans having a peculiar tradition of blowing air into each other's faces during greetings. And surprisingly, it earned a soft ripple of laughter from the princess and a raised eyebrow from the queen. That tiny moment of humor, small and fragile as it was, seemed to shift the mood slightly, proving that even in alien politics, laughter had its place, especially if it came from someone who clearly didn't belong. The moment arrived suddenly, with no warning, in the midst of the queen presenting a holographic projection of interstellar trade routes. The princess leaned toward me, her long ears brushing the air like delicate instruments, and in one impulsive, audacious motion, pressed her lips to mine. Time froze. The floating lights flickered nervously, the teacups hovered midair, and the advisor's whispers became a silent chorus of shock. I barely had time to register the sensation before my human instincts kicked in, a mixture of panic, exhilaration, and absurd disbelief. I stammered, I think I owe taxes? And she laughed, the sound light and triumphant, echoing against walls that seemed to pulse in agreement. The queen, poised and formidable, froze, eyes wide with a combination of astonishment and calculation. The room remained silent, each courtier processing the audacity of a human being kissed by the princess in full view of royalty. I could almost hear the thought bubbles of alien minds calculating potential political fallout, potential alliances gained or broken, and whether humans were generally dangerous or merely chaotic in amusing ways. I stood there, frozen but strangely exhilarated as the princess squeezed my hand, a tiny gesture that carried more reassurance than any speech could. Some rules, she said, ears twitching, exist only to be bent, preferably with style. After the initial shock wore off, murmurs spread through the court, some scandalized, some secretly delighted, and a few quietly impressed by my accidental bravery. The queen finally spoke, her voice firm but not unkind. You, human, have survived our palace not merely by wit but by charm. I blinked, struggling to process the gravity of the compliment and the absurdity of the situation simultaneously. The princess leaned closer again, whispering that charm, humor, and unpredictability were the true weapons in navigating alien courts. I nodded, realizing that my survival had relied less on skill and more on adaptability, laughter, and occasionally, sheer luck. The rest of the day unfolded in a blur of interstellar etiquette, floating meals, and cautious attempts at humor to diffuse lingering tension. I discovered that the advisors, though initially wary, had begun to see me not as a threat but as a unique anomaly, one who could turn protocol into performance art without detonating diplomacy entirely. The princess guided me with gentle nudges and teasing remarks, each step teaching me more about alien expectations, political nuance, and the value of humor even in tense situations. I realized I was changing, slowly shedding the clumsy uncertainty of a human outsider, growing into someone who could navigate complexity with both wit and intuition. By evening, the palace seemed to breathe with satisfaction, walls glowing softly, lights drifting gently, and the queen observing from her throne with a measured, approving gaze. The princess and I sat together in a quiet alcove, the stars of distant galaxies projected around us, each point of light shimmering like a reminder of all we had navigated. I joked about how humans typically trip into galactic crises, and she laughed, resting her hand lightly on mine. I felt the absurd thrill of survival mixed with accomplishment. I had been tested, embarrassed, challenged, and somehow emerged not just intact, but respected. The princess leaned closer, ears twitching with amusement, and whispered that this was only the beginning of our adventures, that rules were flexible, and life was richer with unpredictability. I realized then that my perspective had shifted. Where I once would have feared mistakes, I now recognized the power of laughter, boldness, and connection, even across species and galaxies. The palace was no longer an intimidating labyrinth, but a place of possibility, humor, and unexpected alliances. When I finally retired to my chamber, exhausted but exhilarated, I reflected on how far I had come. I had entered as a human guest, uncertain, awkward, and at the mercy of alien protocol. I would leave, or perhaps remain, a participant in a world of astonishing complexity, skilled in humor, diplomacy, and the subtle art of charm. And most importantly, I had survived, laughed, and been kissed by a princess with long, elegant ears, leaving me irrevocably changed, and for the first time in my life, entirely certain that adventure was as much about who you became as what you endured.